Yeah. We'll be getting started in just a minute. Um, just waiting for a few more to come on. So, good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock. Before we begin, please make sure that your microphones are muted as this session is being recorded. We'll have time for a Q&A session at the end. Today, we're delving into our presentation, Homefront, Syracuse, Central New York, and World War II. Leading us through this exploration is Dan Smith, head librarian of the Local History and Genealogy Department at Onondaga County Public Library's Central Library.
Thanks, Kate. This year marks the 80th anniversary of the D-Day invasion during World War II, with the push to victory in Europe, and we thought it might be an opportunity to explore the role of the local home front in the war effort. As the decades pass and the living memory of the wartime fades, there's a tendency to view the World War as a steady march to victory that began with Pearl Harbor and ended with VJ Day. Of course, the reality was more complex, and local communities around the country played vital supporting roles in these national events. To really get a feel for the part that Syracuse and Central New York played during the war, it's useful to look at local life in the years just before the war and how the national scene affected our local area. It doesn't seem to be, excuse me, a little technical difficulty here. There we go. Syracuse itself, at the end of the 1930s, had a population of just over 200,000, just shy of being the 40th largest city in the country. The 1940 census recorded 27,550 foreign-born residents and 2,082 African-American citizens, along with 245 of other races. The city boundaries were taking shape close to the outline that we know today, with Eastwood and the Valley neighborhoods having been annexed a decade earlier. The last years of the 30s saw a lot of changes in what today we'd call infrastructure projects. By 1941, both the New York Central and the D&W railroads were elevated from street level, although the raised roadbeds did create their own new barriers. Streetcars were replaced by bus lines. And Pioneer Homes, one of the earliest of the federal housing projects, was filled with residents. And although the city's largest employer, the Franklin Car Company, had closed years earlier, the move of the Carrier Corporation into the old plant on Geddes Street was a promising development. Like our view of World War II, we tend to look at the Great Depression as something remedied by the New Deal with a decade of steady recovery. Often forgotten is the nationwide recession that began in 1937 and lasted well into the next year, when the stock market fell and unemployment crept back up to close to 20%, close to the worst years of the early Depression. Syracuse felt the effects of the recession with rising unemployment and increased numbers on relief. At the same time, world events were having a local effect. As a city with a large number of first and second generation immigrants, news of European events was of major interest, with the possibility of American involvement subject of hot debate. And various movements, ranging from isolationism to interventionism, competed for popular opinion in those years. And one movement that tested the local waters was a German-American Bund. Now, this organization sought to foster American support for Nazi Germany and solicited citizens of German descent for membership. The boon found little traction in Syracuse, soundly rejected by both native and immigrant citizens across upstate New York. In contrast, while moral support for nations facing aggression from dictatorships in Europe and Japan was fairly widespread, popular sentiment for an American military response wasn't strong. King George VI became the first British monarch to visit America in June of 1939, spending much of his tour in New York State and conferring with President Roosevelt to strengthen an Anglo-American alliance. American preparedness became a priority following Hitler's invasion of Poland in September 1939 and a declaration of war by Britain and France. Defense spending increased, and orders from Europe for supplies and war goods stimulated the local and national economy in the years before Lend-Lease became actual policy. Security tightened locally throughout 1940, with some venues, like the Arena on South Salina Street and the Armory on Jefferson Street, being closed to public events. In the fall of 1940, registration for the draft became law with the signing of the Selective Service Act. While not yet an American fight, the war made the Dominion of Canada, as part of the United Kingdom, a belligerent, and escaping German POWs from Canadian prison camps often made area headlines as they crossed the St. Lawrence into New York State. This flyer was captured in Ogdensburg and gave himself up after crossing the St. Lawrence in 41. Now, aviation had come into its own by the late 30s, and Syracuse was an early hub of air travel, having built a municipal airport at Amboy in the late 20s with the support of Mayor Charles Hanna, who was a pilot himself. Both Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart landed at Amboy Airport during their Syracuse visits. However, when newsreels of the London Blitz made warfare by air a reality to American audiences, plans for air raid drills in Syracuse began as early as September 1941. So when news of Pearl Harbor reached the East Coast one Sunday afternoon in early December, American entry into the war wasn't as much as a surprise as was the location of the attack. Often after the initial shock of the news, the next question was, where is Pearl Harbor? Reaction to Pearl Harbor was in some ways similar to the uncertainty that followed 9/11, with Syracuse, like the country, placed on high alert. Local news articles reflect some of that anxiety those first few weeks following Pearl Harbor. Municipal safety was top concern for city leaders, and potential sabotage targets were given extra security, even at the city reservoirs. Almost immediately, major work began on government projects relating to the war effort. The state fairgrounds became the Syracuse Army Air Force's storage depot. Within a year, the depot had a workforce of more than 1,300 civilian employees handling supplies ranging from propellers to parachutes. It's something like an Amazon warehouse for the Air Corps. Months before American entry into the war, it was realized that the municipal airport at Amboy would require a lot of expansion if it was going to handle the newest military planes. Instead of Amboy, 2,100 acres of land in Mantydale became the training and staging areas for B-17s and B-24s on their way north and across the Atlantic. Several farms in Cicero and Salina and DeWitt, just north of the city, had to be quickly vacated as construction of the new base began almost immediately. By August of 1942, the base had 1,200 airmen and remained in operation for the duration of the war. One of the largest local projects was the New York Ordnance Work in Baldwinsville that got underway in 1943 and covered a huge area of what today is Radisson. Historian Bonnie Kisselstein will give a detailed presentation on the Ordnance Works this fall. The city was organized into 21 civil defense sectors, with volunteer air wardens responsible for each sector. Volunteer plane spotters throughout the county took shifts scanning the sky for aircraft. The city conducted its first official air raid drill in late December 1941. Downtown traffic stopped and people gathered in buildings or doorways until the all clear signal sounded. In 1940, as the war in Europe was heating up, Congress had passed the Alien Registration Act, requiring residents who weren't naturalized citizens to register with the government. After Pearl Harbor, aliens from Axis nations were required to re-register and needed permission to travel outside the city. They couldn't possess a gun or a camera. They were allowed to have a radio, but only if it couldn't receive shortwave broadcasts. Syracuse had about 4,000 alien residents from Axis nations at that time, with the largest number coming from Italy. Most of these restrictions were lifted by the end of 1942. Daily life changed pretty quickly for everyone during 42. People still went to the movies, but things like the circus and the state fair were gone for the duration. Even before Pearl Harbor, supply shortages were being felt as the U.S. scrambled to rearm and Lend-Lease increased demand for supplies going to Britain. Scrap drives that began months before December 7th were stepped up with metals like aluminum and copper in high demand. With pretty impressive speed, a complex system of rationing developed, overseen by the Office of Price Administration. People became familiar with ration books and a point system that covered everything from sugar and meat to shoes and bicycles. Victor gardens were encouraged to boost home menus. When copper supply shifted to war production, even coins were affected. The zinc-plated steel pennies produced in the early years of the war still occasionally turn up in change. The zinc-plated ones are the ones on the right in the slide. Automobile manufacturing stopped in February, and new cars became rationed. 1,800 new 1942 models were stored at the fairgrounds, in the horticultural building and other buildings at the fair to be sold to essential users, such as doctors and emergency service workers. Gasoline was also rationed, with letter stickers of A, B, or C to be displayed on the windshield, indicating the weekly gas allotment based on travel needs. The A sticker, the lowest sticker, allowed drivers 3 to 5 gallons per week. Although gas was rationed because of the war, it was still produced in the United States. The real shortage was rubber, with the rubber plantations on the Malay Peninsula in Japanese control. Synthetic rubber was still a bit of a novelty, and tires were in short supply. Often they were the target of thieves, as this article that appeared in early 42 in the Syracuse papers shows about the theft of the tires out of a car on Onondaga Street. Well, decades after the war, we have the benefit of knowing how things would turn out. It's difficult for us to comprehend how bleak things looked in the early years of the war. The map of Europe showed most of the continent under Axis control, the same with the Western Pacific. If you talk to someone who was a young adult at that time, they'll probably recall checking the daily casualty lists in the newspapers for the names of classmates and friends. V-mail provided families and friends about the only way to keep in touch with their servicemen. The replies from GIs passed a censor before they could be sent back to the States from the war zones. Bond drives and scrap collections sought to boost civilian morale and aid the war effort. The Syracuse Public Library was a collection site for the Victory Brook campaign, sending hundreds of volumes to army camps around the country. The war's impact on the Syracuse economy was dramatic. More than 70 Central New York manufacturers were engaged in defense work, and already there was a shortage of skilled labor. Local businesses became subcontractors for large or national companies. The newspapers were filled with the help wanted ads that targeted women and retirees with economic and patriotic appeals. Virtually anyone wanted a job could find one, and the relief rolls shrank. The workforce expanded so quickly that housing became a challenge. Wages increased, and people generally had more spending money, but rationing and shortages left fewer things to buy. Many items had ceiling or maximum prices set by the Office of Price Administration, but there were still inflation pressure as more dollars were chasing increasingly fewer consumer goods. Syracuse area businesses and factories supplied the war effort with items ranging from pharmaceuticals and ceramics to heavy equipment and armaments. Bristol Myers bought a small laboratory company on Taylor Street before constructing a factory along Thompson Road that became one of the country's largest penicillin producers before the end of the war. Carrier had moved into the old Franklin plant on Geddes Street in the late 30s, just as air conditioning was becoming a popular feature in the commercial buildings. Carrier designed climate control systems for munition plants and storage facilities and equipped more than 2,000 ships with marine refrigeration. Now, the remnants of the old Franklin Automobile Company became air-cooled motors, making engines for light military planes and the early Sikorsky helicopters. Krauss-Heinz, famous for traffic lights, made searchlights and airport lighting, along with floodlights for beach landings and signaling equipment. General Electric came to Syracuse in 1942, building facilities on Wolf Street and Thompson Road to make radio and radar equipment, along with the turboelectric drives used in some destroyer escorts. New process gear made transmissions and transfer cases for trucks and tanks, in addition to the gears used in airplane propellers. Nearby, the Light Railway Corporation made heavy-duty clutches for large trucks and the M3 tank. Railway bearings could be found in everything from train cars to gun turrets, even those on large ships like the battleship Missouri. Precision Casting, known for cast zinc and aluminum products, manufactured bomb fuses. They also made handles for combat knives equipped with blades from Camillus cutlery. The Prosperity Company constructed mobile laundry units for use by armies in the field. L.C. Smith Typewriter Company tooled up to build the famous Springfield rifle. This was the World War I rifle that was standard issue in the first years of World War II. The Lennox Furnace Company converted to make something called Marston mats. These were portable landing strips made of interlocking steel sections used to quickly construct airfields in Europe and the Pacific. The Lamson Corporation, best known for the pneumatic vacuum tube systems used by cashiers and department stores before the war made mounting tripods for machine guns. On the other side of town, Brown-like Chapin on Marcellus Street made more than 100,000 50 caliber machine guns during the war. When production began, the guns were test fired on the factory roof, much to the disturbance of the residential neighbors. One of the company's maintenance men came up with the idea of test firing the weapons into water-filled tubes, and the operation was moved to the basement. It also allowed for the recovery of the bullets from the tank rather than sifting them out of sandbags on the roof. Syracuse, China produced ceramic products for the military, ranging from cereal bowls to anti-tank mines. Using electrical components from Salve's Pass and Seymour Company, the mines were field tested by company staff in Highland Forest. Factories often operated around the clock, scheduling third and fourth shifts, and keeping worker morale high was important. Several local firms received the Army-Navy E for excellence that the War Department awarded companies that met production and quality goals. A radio program that aired on WFBL, sponsored by Onondaga Savings Bank, honored a different war worker each weekday with a Distinguished Citizen citation. As the Allies began winning victories in North Africa and Italy, and later on the continent following D-Day, large numbers of Axis soldiers became POWs. There were over 400,000 German prisoners interned in the U.S. by 1945, and several POW camps were located in upstate New York, with the nearest to Syracuse being the old Civilian Conservation Corps barracks in Green Lake State Park. The prisoners received 80 cents a day in scrip if they chose to work, and could be found on jobs ranging from hoeing weeds on area farms to shoveling snow in downtown Syracuse. Some prisoners even contributed to the American Red Cross. With the defeat of the Axis in Europe in May 1945, attention shifted to ending the Pacific War. When VJ Day finally arrived, the signing of the Japanese surrender in September on the deck of the Missouri had a local connection. One of the witnesses to the event was General Jonathan Wainwright, whose wife was from Skaneateles. Mrs. Wainwright lived with her family here, while the general himself spent the war interned in a Japanese prison camp following the fall of the Philippines in early 1942. As welcome as it was, the abrupt end of the war in the Pacific caught government administrators off guard. The nation and the military had been braced for what was anticipated to be a lengthy struggle for the Japanese home islands. Plans for the post-war peacetime economy were still incomplete. Rationing ended for most items by the end of 1945, but supply shortages still made things hard to get. There were waiting lists for everything from telephones to automobiles, with eager customers ready to spend their wartime earnings. Inflation ran high, and there were labor strikes across major industries. It really took a few years for things to ease and the economy to stabilize. The end of the war brought changes to the local way of life, reflecting the changes to the nation and the world. The war had claimed the lives of more than 1,000 Onondaga County residents in military service. Returning veterans came home and took advantage of the GI Bill, boosting enrollment at Syracuse University and the new Lemoyne College. The demand for new housing grew, and suburban development drew population away from the city center. Companies like Carrier and General Electric and New Process Gear and others that would become staples in the future of the local economy built new facilities on the outskirts of town, replacing downtown factories worn out by wartime production. The state fairgrounds returned to its original function as home of the state fair. The Syracuse Army Air Base became the Hancock International Airport as air travel gained popularity, much of it driven by the public's familiarity with aviation that was gained during the war. Rather than trying to list all the lasting influences of the war front and those war's effect on Syracuse and Central New York, it's probably fitting to end with a look at our local tribute to those who served and sacrificed from Syracuse and Onondaga County. Even before the war's end, plans were being made to honor local veterans and the fallen of all previous wars. It was decided early on that the new memorial should be more than a static monument, but something that would serve the living as well as honor the dead. The Gold Star Mothers broke ground for the Onondaga County War Memorial in October 1949, and that began a 2-year project that would include a venue for civic gatherings and public events. The new building featured a poured concrete roof, something of a novelty at that time. Husband and wife artists Lee and Claire Trim were commissioned to create murals for the interior. The facility cost $4 million to complete, the equivalent of about $52 million today, and could seat 9,000 in the auditorium. The War Memorial opened in September 1951 with ceremonies that included Governor Dewey and a Congressional Medal of Honor winner. Dedication events featured concerts by the Sammy Kaye and Freddie Martin orchestras, as well as the Army Band and a country music band. The facility's creators intended it to be a living memorial, and we've long known it to be the home of shows and sporting events, concerts, and conventions. But since its beginning, the Memorial Hall area on the north side of the building was set aside as a space dedicated to the solemn remembrance of the county's war dead. The War Memorial itself faced its own battle in the early 1990s from pressure to replace the building with a larger, more modern facility. Support from veterans and a few county legislators saved the building from demolition. The renovated War Memorial is now part of the On-Center Convention Complex. Even with the renovations, the Memorial Hall area still retains its quiet, reflective character in remembrance of the local men and women who gave their lives in service to the country. The renovated memorial incorporates murals honoring the Korean and Vietnam Wars, along with more recent conflicts, and includes displays of military artifacts. Well, with today being Flag Day, one last Syracuse connection to mention that's on display at the War Memorial is this tribute to Syracuse and Bud Stapleton, who raised the first American flag over Tokyo in early September 1945. So those are the slides we have today, and thank you for listening, and I'll turn it back over to Kate.
Yes, thank you, Dan. That was wonderful. Yes, any questions or comments?
Yeah, can you tell me if there's any comprehensive list of all the people who served and all the people who died from Onondaga County in World War I and World War II?
Well, in the War Memorial, there is a list of those that were known at that moment that were killed during World War II, and I believe also there's a reference in there for World War I. We do have scrapbooks that were compiled by the library after the war and into the early 50s of the ones that were noted in the paper. So the figure is given something around 1,400, 1,200 Onondaga County residents, those people that were enlisted from Onondaga County or gave their location when they were drafted as Onondaga County locations. So, but yeah, there's a couple sources. There is a display at the War Memorial that has an electronic database too of people that are veterans that served from Onondaga County. So they've tried to include not just those that were killed, but also those who had served from Onondaga County.
I noticed that photo that you were talking about, the returning veterans and the GI Bill, and you showed a picture of a bunch of houses lined up. Looks like you said they were expanding into the suburbs. Were there homes built specifically for returning GIs, A, and B? That picture we saw, are those houses still extant? Are they where are they located?
Well, they weren't necessarily built explicitly for GIs, although Syracuse University did add housing for returning veterans as part of their dormitory setup. But much of the housing that developed there had been pent-up demand during the war for some housing. The French communities were already starting to build a little bit just before the war, and there was a housing shortage, kind of like they're talking now potentially with the Micron that happened during the war. You can see the slide there with the trailers. That particular slide was of a development, a photo from Waterloo that ran in the paper. So it wasn't Syracuse exclusively that was feeling these housing pressures or desire to build outside, but a lot of upstate places too.
Thank you.
Are there other questions or comments?
I've a comment. Bonnie Kisselstein from Baldwinsville, and we have had Morris Machine Works where they invented the centrifugal pump.
Oh.
And excuse me. They made guns for and for the war, and they also helped with the atomic bomb.
Yes, yes. Morris is an old time company. Yes, that there were a lot of locations in it was the ones we talked about were mostly ones that had some publicity in the paper about what they were doing in those times, and it was interesting that it was difficult to find some photos of some of these things, mostly because you weren't allowed to take photos of places
Right.
like the fairgrounds or that many pictures of the ordnance works, or so it was kind of a security concern back then. That we don't have a lot of documents, but it's good to know that, like Morris Pump and other locations, there was a Benedict silver making place in East Syracuse that did things that weren't necessarily recorded in the paper. Yeah.
And SU took over some of the defunct buildings from the ordnance works and housed some of the men or some of the veterans that are there for schooling and took them back and forth.
Oh, did they commute back there? Wow, that's didn't know that. I know that there's a lot of surplus barracks too along the air base too that eventually got torn down, but were probably used immediately after the war.
Yes, we have a question in the chat from Linda. What dates, month, year were the articles on the Bund?
On the Bund, they were from
Yeah.
1939 and 38. I can give them to you later when I get those back up here, but it was I believe it was 38.
Oh.
So that that had
Okay.
a lot of publicity back then, and just in those years, essentially before the war started in Europe itself.
Ah. And she also has the question, are there any places, repositories, and or resources to find more information on the World War II civil defense citizens known as Minutemen?
Well, I know that in World War I, they had a group called 3 Minutemen that were people that their goal was to be able to give a 3-minute speech on why America was in World War I. But the Minutemen, I don't know the civil defense Minuteman history. There really isn't too much that I was able to find on the civil defense efforts during the war itself. There's a lot of articles about it and how they trained plane spotters and other people to provide little volunteer security for different installations and things, auxiliary corps along that line. But no, the Minutemen, I don't know. I'd have to look up about that, the civil defense Minutemen. I'm not sure of a book dedicated on that.
Oh, I see. She shares that her grandparents in Broome County were listed as Minutemen in 1942 newspapers.
Oh, well, they could have, yes. Maybe that was another group that developed to support or to annex auxiliary help for the civil defense, the air raid wardens system. I know that many rural places, people took turns to for sky watching. That was an official thing. And they say the early model airplane industry, the little plastic models that became kits later on, were originally developed so people could identify the shape of planes and things during the 40s there in the war.
Following on that, you did say that they had air raid wardens, and sounded like they were prepared for air raids. I mean, of course, my father grew up in World War II, and for them it was real. He was in Manchester, England.
Oh, yes.
Went into bomb shelters. He describes that as a regular occurrence because there's a lot of industry in Manchester. In fact, a lot of industry in Syracuse. So, I mean, when you think, actually, there was a lot of things being constructed here. So I suppose it was very real, the idea that they might come here. But did they actually ever have a drill where people, sorry, not a drill. Well, I guess how often did they have drills? Because I was just trying to picture how long it would take for people to come from Europe over Syracuse.
Oh, well, yeah, I don't know if, you know what, I know that they had practice drills here. My mother would talk about you would have to, if you were downtown, you would have to go into a building and the cars, the traffic would stop. And if it was at night, they would douse the lights. And the articles show that they did the first ones late in December of 41. So it was something that they started, and I don't know how many they had over the duration of the war, but at least several. They were trying to improve their response time. The reality of an airplane, enemy airplane coming over Syracuse, I don't know if it was realistic, but they'd seen enough of what happened to places in England and such with aerial warfare, and Canada being in the war itself earlier on. There were, like, as you indicated, a lot of potential targets in the Central New York area that could have been, you know, we had a heavy industry base then, and they've been logical targets for someone that wanted to reduce the capacity to produce materiel for the war.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Dan, do you know if there are any German fraternal organizations that were popular in the 20s, 30s, 40s? And do you have any information on any of those organizations?
Well, there was another organization called Hammurabi, or it began with an H, and Harangue, and it was kind of like a German social club. But there was the Turnverein, the kind of the Turners, but both of those, all the German clubs rejected this the Bund movement in general. But there were a lot of associations. Clubs in general were quite popular, probably before World War II, and especially in early parts of the 1900s. There, all different kinds of clubs, like the Foresters, the Elks, the things we think of today, but the order of any. The city directories list dozens of associations and fraternities that people belonged to in those years. But in terms of German clubs, one that I think lasted the longest would have been the Turners on the north side of Syracuse. And, but there was another one in the 30s that was approached by the Bund too, that finally rejected getting involved with that.
And do you have
Dan,
information, files on
No.
these organizations?
No, most of them are we have some books on ethnic groups in Syracuse, clippings, scrapbooks, and they'll mention
Okay.
them in passing. And we do have the online sources of the newspaper archives that if you search those, the articles on those do come up. I haven't seen a standalone. We do have a book on Germans in Syracuse and Onondaga County that was written, though, probably at the turn of the century, so it's a little bit before this era.
Okay, and is that the one that's online?
I don't know if part of it now is online. A woman translated it for us
Okay,
years ago, when we have a partial translation of it.
okay, thank you.
Dan or Kate, this is another Dan. There was a book, a series of books that were created after the war ended, from photographs taken by the reporters accompanying the troops, and also by the military themselves, of the aftermath and what was there, particularly when they got to the camps where the people were killed. I just wonder if the library has a copy of that. It's an amazing collection.
Yes, there was a series that was compiled of, I think, news and government photographers that on different parts of the war. I think I can visualize the set you mean, and it came out shortly after the war.
Yeah,
I think we do have a few volumes of those. I'm not sure if we have a complete set of those. We used to have those were in circulation.
if it's the same one I have the complete set. My parents bought it. I think it was, you would get one, buy one a month or something like that. And it just was amazing.
Yes.
And I still have it. And maybe sometime when I come down to see you, Dan, I'll bring it and share one of the volumes.
Be good to see it. Yes.
Yeah.
It's one thing about that war compared to the earlier ones, that the photography was much more advanced. We have more images now of
Right.
that than previous history.
We have a question from Robert Bowles in the chat. And he says, my first cousin, Gerald Bowles Jr., died in the sinking of the USS Liscombe Bay. How many from Syracuse died in that second war?
How many died during World War II? Is that the question? From Syracuse?
I believe so, from Syracuse.
Yeah, the number I came when I was looking up, it was over 1,000. It's something between 12 and 1,400 are were lost from Syracuse and Onondaga County in all branches of the service during World War II.
Okay. And are there any other questions or comments? Well, if not, Our next session will be the OCPL Genealogy Group, Roots and Branches, Creative Ways to Share Our Family Trees. And that will be Friday, June 28th from 10 to 11 a.m. And for those of you who might just be interested more in local history, the next one of those will be on Friday, July 12th. And that will be from sandlots to stadiums, exploring Syracuse's minor league baseball legacy. So with that, let's see, we've got a couple more chats. Yes, thank yous. Okay, with that, I will be I'm working on getting the backlog of recordings edited so that they can get out. So we'll try and get this one out sooner rather than later. I will send out a copy of the chat log with any information that was requested during this session. With that, I wish you all a lovely day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks,
Thank
Kate.
you all.
And thanks, Kate. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, this was great.
Yeah,
Oh,
thank
great.
you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Yes.